Hello everyone and welcome to the third video on my new channel, Magical History Tour. We're building a channel on history, politics, and culture, so if you could please give the video a like and subscribe, that'd be greatly appreciated. My goal is to upload every Sunday, and though today is Tuesday, maybe I can accomplish that goal next week. So now, on with our feature presentation. The 1912 election was one of the most consequential in American history. In first place was Woodrow Wilson, who would go on to be president for the next 8 years. In second place was ex-president Theodore Roosevelt, who would mount just about the best third-party presidential candidacy in American history. And all the way in third, due to a split in the traditional Republican voting bloc, was the current president, William Howard Taft. It seemed like an indictment on his presidency. The big man had been defeated badly, and he admitted as much. As a matter of fact, it was a clue in last Thursday's New York Times crossword puzzle. He said of himself in 1912, "No one candidate was ever elected ex-president by such a large majority." But who is this humble man, commonly regarded by historians as a mid-tier president? Well, let's examine old William Howard Taft. Some of the reasons I like him as both a president and a person. But before that, let's examine his roots, shall we? William Howard Taft was born in 1857 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Unlike many of the political figures of his time period, he was not born into a wealthy family. They were certainly not broke, but lived in a modest suburban home in Ohio. His father, Alfonso, did have some influence in Republican politics, serving as the Secretary of War under Ulysses S. Grant. Taft also wasn't one of the geniuses to succeed to the office of the presidency. He was not a Jefferson or a Madison. Instead, he worked hard for his achievements as a youth. He graduated second in his class at Yale College, with a classmate commenting that he succeeded through hard work and integrity, rather than pure intelligence. These young pictures of Taft perhaps don't show him as the hulking, mustachioed man we know him as today, but make no mistake, Taft was a wrestling champ, just like a Republican president that came before him, Abraham Lincoln. After Taft rose through the ranks of being an Ohio lawyer and judge, the time came when a big promotion was considered. His lifelong ambition was to become a Supreme Court justice, and at only age 32, he could have tied Joseph Story for being the youngest appointee to ever make it to the nation's highest court. But instead, President Benjamin Harrison appointed Taft to become a U.S. Solicitor General. As the Solicitor General, Taft's job was to conduct government litigation at the U.S. Supreme Court, which he was very successful at, winning 15 of the 18 cases that he argued. Later on, he'd go on to serve as a federal judge. Taft earned a somewhat conservative reputation, especially considering he was not a fan of William Jennings Bryan's plan in 1896 to allow for the free coinage of silver. He saw this as money radicalism and stood behind Republican candidate William McKinley and his successful campaign, fearing that free silver movement would lead to more inflation. However, Taft was not always behind moneyed interests, and certainly not always in his rulings as a judge. For example, his ruling in U.S. versus Addison Pipe and Steel Company, which was later upheld by the Supreme Court, helped revive the legislation known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, according to one Taft biographer. Then in the year 1900, Taft was called to President McKinley's office, and he was excited. It went a little something like this. "Hello, Mr. President, is this about a vacancy on the Supreme Court?" "Nope, Governor of the Philippines." "Will you put me on the Supreme Court eventually if I take this job?" "Sure." Anyway, Taft did take the job as military governor of the Philippines, and in a time of racial bigotry, Taft was known for his relative racial tolerance. I say relative because yes, if we judge Taft's views by today's standards, he'd certainly be considered racist, but the same goes for nearly every politician of this era. Now, the Philippine-American War was an ugly chapter in American history that doesn't get talked about enough in American history classes. Mr. Beat has a whole video about that. Taft did not have a spotless record in this war. As Governor General, he oversaw the final phase of the Philippine-American War, and even approved of General James Franklin Bell's use of concentration camps. Dang. But importantly, Taft did not think of the Filipinos as racial inferiors like many other white people at this time did, saying, "We propose to banish this idea from their minds." Taft did not impose racial segregation at social events, and his wife, Nellie Taft, was definitely the true voice of his conscience, saying, "Neither politics nor race should influence our hospitality in any way." Taft never got his Supreme Court seat from McKinley because McKinley was shot dead. Theodore Roosevelt took over as president, and Taft was now his Secretary of War. During his time in office, Taft was often seen as Roosevelt's right-hand man, helping him in affairs in Cuba, the Philippines, and of course the Panama Canal. He still kept an eye on a Supreme Court seat, and when a vacancy opened in 1906, Roosevelt offered Taft the gig. Taft essentially sighed and said, "But really, you want me to be the next president, don't you?" And so he turned it down, even though in his heart, Taft really did not want the power of the presidency. He wanted to still be a Supreme Court justice. But no, instead he was Teddy's hand-picked successor, as delightfully depicted in this Puck cartoon. Taft would go on to win the 1908 election against who else but William Jennings Bryan, who had lost his third contest now as the Democratic presidential nominee. Yikes. As we can see here, Taft swept the industrial Northeast and Midwest, as well as much of the West Coast. Bryan had run a progressive campaign, as he had done in his previous losses in 1896 and 1900, but Taft cut away some of that support by adopting some progressive policies of his own. Of course, the president he worked under, in Teddy Roosevelt, was known as a progressive-era reformer. Republicans of this time also had a funny slogan, saying, "Vote for Taft now, you can vote for Bryan anytime." This, of course, referencing the fact that Bryan had already been defeated twice. Taft took over as president in 1909, and what's interesting is this is right at a time when we could start to hear recordings of what it is the president's voice actually sounded like. Presidents like McKinley and Roosevelt who came before him spoke with a posh, educated accent. Trust me, if you listen to Roosevelt speak, he does not quite have the gruff voice you'd think he does. Those two are almost hard to understand with how they talked, and other presidents that come after Taft would speak with sort of an elitist, mid-Atlantic accent. Notably, FDR talked like this. There are some elements of British still left in there. But Taft, he had a voice of the people. His inflections and the way he talked make it seem as if he could honestly be talking in the 21st century, whereas there's no way you'd say that about the other presidents of this era. Now, take a listen to him give this speech during his presidency on world peace, and notice not just how he talks, but what he is talking about.
I am willing to admit that war has accomplished much in the progress of the world. I'm willing to admit that there are certain crises in the forward march of Christian civilization that perhaps could not have been met in any other way than by the sword. I'm willing to admit that war develops certain heroic traits in men and furnishes a test for the evidence of the highest character. Perhaps, too, it trains and disciplines people. But the other side of the picture justifies the prayer of every man, of every civilized man, that war should be abolished, and that the suffering, cruelty, corruption, and demoralization that follow in its train should be, as far as we can bring it about, lifted as a burden from the human race.
It should be noted that Taft gave that speech just 5 years before World War I broke out. Talk about having a prescient message. But let's talk about Taft's domestic agenda now. He was famous for running an efficient government, as Taft busted more trusts than Roosevelt ever did, bringing up a total of 99 antitrust prosecutions. One of the best examples of this was a prosecution that Taft won against the American Sugar Refining Company, where a trust of sugar manufacturers had rigged prices for the consumers. I think it's about time the American government fights back against the greedy shrinkflation prices that are currently happening with manufacturers. Congress and Biden need to take a page out of Taft's playbook. But anyway, the unfortunate part of this is Taft did have some more business-friendly Republican crony friends in the party, and he would slow down his trust-busting later in his term as president, and this of course drew the ire of Roosevelt, who ran against him in 1912. But besides busting trusts, another domestic item which Taft succeeded in was his signing of the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910. This allowed the Interstate Commerce Commission to set railroad rates, as again, railroad rate hikes were screwing over consumers. The Taft presidency was also a time of progressive change in terms of how the Constitution was being amended. My 9th grade history teacher once told me of the importance of the 16th through 19th Amendments, which she called taxes, senators, booze, and chicks, as a mnemonic. In other words, an income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition, and women's suffrage. The first half of those constitutional amendments came under Taft's presidency. He supported that federal income tax, and although there was some arm twisting for the direct election of senators, he ended up supporting that one too. I can't pretend that Taft's presidency was all sunshine and rainbows. I'm not a fan of his foreign policy, which was called dollar diplomacy, or as I explained it to my students, donut diplomacy, because, you know, it's Taft. Now, it was called dollar diplomacy because, unlike Roosevelt, Taft wanted to use foreign intervention more as a means of encouraging U.S. investment in Central and Latin America, as well as China. Well, trade actually declined between the U.S. and China, and in Central America, oh boy. U.S. intervention there only inspired nationalist movements which were resentful of America. I mean, what Taft did in Nicaragua is a clear example of this. He sent 2,700 Marines to stabilize the region where a more conservative U.S.-friendly regime was threatened. Now, Taft had good intentions with some of his foreign policies, as he wanted to rescue Central American countries like Honduras from their debt, though he largely failed in this regard too. But overall, donut diplomacy was a failure. And while it's more high tariffs and not being progressive enough that cost Taft in 1912, this is what I remember as Taft's biggest failure. But now his presidency is over, let's focus on some more cheery things, shall we? Alright, here's the more personal reasons I like Taft. First of all, I'm willing to admit that I do like Taft because of his ravenous appetite. As someone who's a heavy eater, so to speak, I admire Taft not just because he was an eater too, but also because he was man enough to admit when it became a problem, and actually lost weight. Now, Taft's weight fluctuated throughout his adult life, it looks like, and this thumbnail perhaps shows him at his enormous 350-pound peak. But his weight loss endeavors show that he'd committed to diets at points in his life. For example, from 1905 to 06, before he became president, he went from 314 to 255 pounds, shedding an impressive 60 pounds in the span of just a few months. Before and after pictures clearly show Taft having lost weight, and this one in particular, it's impressive. You might as well put old Will on a modern nutrition magazine. But as a story of Taft's weakness for food, I let my students and my student teaching know a certain interesting fact about Taft. Now, apparently Taft ate a 12-ounce steak for breakfast every morning while he served as president. This guy didn't eat steaks for dinner, not even lunch. No, he woke up to a big hunk of steak every morning for breakfast. PETA, look away from Big Bill. Another interesting fact I like about Taft, he was the first president to throw a first pitch at a baseball game. This to me is an all-American tradition, and it's a shame to me that Obama is the last president to have done it. Yes, Trump and Biden haven't thrown out a first pitch, so the tradition is kinda dead now. Now, George Bush's right down the middle first pitch in Yankee Stadium after 9/11 will never be topped as the greatest presidential first pitch of all time. However, the tradition started with Taft, and he did look like a boss while doing so. He threw out this pitch in 1910 at a Washington Senators game. And yes, the Senators are no longer a baseball team. As I said earlier, Obama was the last presidential first pitch guy, pitching at a Washington Nationals game. In terms of the more goofy reasons to love Taft, there's the old tale that Big Bill got stuck in the White House bathtub, and had to get 6 people to remove his naked body out of there. There's even this delightful children's book called President Taft is Stuck in the Bath that does an excellent job at colorfully portraying this tall tale. But as someone with a bachelor's degree in history, I think it's time to officially dispel this myth. There is no documentary evidence that clearly showed that Taft got stuck in a bathtub. However, there is evidence that Taft liked big tubs and he could not lie. Remember, Taft was a man of integrity, he didn't lie. For you see, when Taft wanted to go on a warship to inspect progress on the Panama Canal, he had a specifically designed bathtub for a man of his size in there. Over 7 feet long, 41 inches wide, and weighing a ton. A February 1909 magazine showed 4 men comfortably fitting inside the Taft bathtub. And of course, another reason to like Taft is for what he did in his post-presidency. The fact is, this man eventually got to live out his dream. He served as Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And while his 9 years on the court didn't prove to be as influential as, say, John Marshall, he certainly isn't living in infamy like, say, Roger Taney. To this day, Taft is the only U.S. president to also serve as a justice on the Supreme Court, and it's interesting to me that this hasn't occurred before or since then. But with Taft's strong legal background, he was appointed by Warren Harding in 1921 to serve as Chief Justice. What this also means is that as Chief Justice, Taft administered the oath of office to future presidents Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. And from the Hoover inauguration comes an interesting story. Listen to Taft administer the oath of office here in 1929 and see if you notice anything unusual.
You, Herbert Hoover, do solemnly swear that you will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and, to the best of your ability, that you will preserve, maintain, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I do.
First of all Hoover had to say was "I do," which was maybe what you did notice, as he didn't have to repeat what Taft was saying. But also, Taft said preserve, maintain, and defend as opposed to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And yes, that was a mistake. A 13-year-old middle school girl named Helen Terwilliger sent Taft a letter saying he messed up, and the 71-year-old Taft wrote her a letter back basically saying, "Yeah, I'm old, I screwed up." If only our politicians had this humility nowadays. So taking into account that Taft had both his share of successes and failures, historians may be right to put him in the mid-tier of US presidents. According to a 2010 Siena College historian survey, he gets particularly dinged for his willingness to take risks and his party leadership score. Given what happened to him in 1912, that's pretty easy to see why those scores are low. But the rankings also show Taft earning high marks for his integrity, his background, which of course we talked about, and his intelligence. However, as we said at the start though, Taft worked his way up to being president through hard work mostly, as opposed to his brains. Much like George Washington before him, he didn't really want the office of the presidency. He saw politics more as a stewardship and public service than anything else. Surely this contrasted him with his predecessor Teddy Roosevelt, but to me this is almost refreshing in a politician and something that we could hope to see nowadays. Taft was not the most ambitious or accomplished president, but I truly believe he was among the best men to serve as our president. So what do you think of William Howard Taft? Am I overstating his accomplishments? Do you think his presidency was more success or failure? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you for the next video. Bye bye.